Mason Carter asked for $700 for the final inspection before the private jet took off. The young CEO laughed coldly in front of her pilot, her lawyer, and her crew, saying a single father who fixed planes for hire wasn't worth that much. Mason did not argue. He set the file on the table, looked her in the eye, and said only one thing: "Read page 47 before you fly." An hour later, the engines roared to life, then stopped cold, and the entire airfield fell silent as everyone learned what that page had warned them about. If you want to know exactly what page 47 hid, stay with this story until the very last word. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the gates of Langford Field opened for the morning's only scheduled departure. The private airfield sat on the edge of the city like a monument to money that never had to ask permission, its glass hangars catching the early light, its black cars lined up with the discipline of soldiers. Inside, everything moved with the quiet urgency of people who were paid to make sure nothing ever went wrong, and who had built entire careers on pretending that nothing ever did. Amelia Langford arrived precisely on schedule, the way she always did, stepping out of her car already mid-conversation with someone on the other end of a call about numbers that would soon become headlines. She was the kind of executive magazines liked to photograph in motion, never standing still, never caught without an answer. Her family's company, Langford Aerospace Holdings, had spent 3 generations building engines that other people trusted with their lives, and Amelia had spent her own life being told that trust was simply something you managed, like inventory or quarterly earnings. She was flying to Seattle that morning to close an acquisition worth more money than most people would see across several lifetimes, and in her mind, the only thing standing between her and that signature was time. Time and the slow, irritating machinery of people who insisted on checking things twice. Mason Carter arrived without an entourage. He drove an old pickup truck that had seen more winters than most of the jets parked in that hangar, and he carried his own tools in a scratched metal box that had traveled with him from one airfield to another for the better part of 2 decades. His jacket was worn at the elbows, his boots carried the permanent stain of engine oil, and he moved through the gleaming hangar without trying to impress anyone, because impressing people had never been the part of the job that mattered to him. He looked at aircraft the way some men looked at old friends, searching for the small signs of trouble that nobody else thought to notice. Grace Miller, Amelia's assistant, met him near the tail of the aircraft and explained, in the brisk shorthand of someone used to managing chaos, that the internal maintenance team had flagged an unusual pressure reading the night before and wanted a second set of eyes before departure. Logan Pierce, the director of flight operations, stood a few feet away with his arms crossed, clearly unhappy that an outside contractor had been summoned into what he considered his territory. He introduced Mason to the small assembled group as the independent inspector brought in for a final check, mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that the fee was $700, payable once the report was filed. Amelia barely looked at Mason as he was introduced. She had built her entire adult life around trusting credentials, polish, and pedigree, and the man in front of her carried none of those signals. It did not occur to her that someone dressed like a mechanic might understand her aircraft more intimately than the engineers on her own payroll. Mason did not react to the dismissal in her eyes. He simply asked for the maintenance log from the last 72 hours, the record of any valve replacements, the name of whoever had signed off on the last inspection, and the data from the most recent test flight. The precision of the questions caught the attention of Joseph Reed, the lead pilot, who had flown long enough to recognize a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Logan moved quickly to smooth things over, insisting that everything was already in order and that Mason only needed to sign a quick confirmation to keep the schedule moving. Mason's answer was short and even. He told them he did not sign anything he had not verified with his own hands, and then he turned, picked up his tools, and walked toward the underside of the aircraft while Amelia checked her watch, irritated by the simple fact that every passing minute now felt like it carried a price tag in the millions. Mason began his inspection with a method that had nothing to do with the glowing diagnostic screens mounted along the cabin wall. He listened to the hum of the hydraulic pump with the patience of a man who had learned to hear trouble before it ever showed up on a readout, pressing his palm against housings to feel for vibration that didn't belong, and noting the faint smell of overheated fluid lingering in a corner that had clearly been wiped down too well and too recently. Carter Owen, the young in-house engineer assigned to shadow him, watched with open skepticism, the posture of someone who had been told that outside contractors usually showed up looking for problems that didn't exist so they could pad their invoice. It didn't take long for Mason to find what he was looking for. The technical bay surrounding the secondary pressure valve was unnervingly clean, far cleaner than the rest of the compartment, the kind of cleanliness that suggested someone had recently scrubbed away a trace of leaking fluid rather than simply tidied up after routine maintenance. Carter shifted uncomfortably, because nothing in the official report mentioned any leak at all. Mason asked to see the original maintenance log, not the condensed summary that had been forwarded up to the executive office, and that single request was enough to make Logan appear almost instantly, as though he had been listening from just out of sight. Logan stepped between them, explaining that internal maintenance records were not meant to be shared with outside contractors, no matter how thorough they liked to be. Mason did not raise his voice. He told Logan plainly that without the original log, he would have no choice but to write that there was insufficient data to confirm the aircraft was safe to fly. The sentence landed like a small detonation, because everyone in the hangar understood that a single line like that gave the lead pilot the authority to refuse departure outright. Amelia was summoned moments later, already impatient, asking why a routine inspection was eating into a schedule that had no room left to give. Logan tried to frame the delay as Mason manufacturing drama to justify a higher fee, a narrative that might have worked if Mason had responded with anything resembling outrage. Instead, he simply laid out the numbers, the deviation in pressure response time, the unusually slow reaction of the secondary valve, and a fresh tightening mark on a fastener that should not have needed retightening at all. Amelia listened, but the technical language slid past her like water over stone, and her frustration only deepened, because every sentence she didn't fully understand felt like another minute stolen from her morning. Joseph, however, leaned in closer, recognizing immediately that small failures buried in secondary systems were exactly the kind of thing that turned catastrophic once an aircraft reached cruising altitude. Mason found a thin scratch along a line near the valve cluster, not large enough to be leaking on its own, but exactly the kind of mark left behind when someone had handled a part carelessly or in a hurry. He asked for 20 more minutes to finish documenting what he'd found, and Amelia agreed only reluctantly, warning him that the flight could not be delayed much longer no matter what he discovered. Logan's expression had shifted from irritation to something colder, the look of a man watching someone walk steadily toward a secret he had hoped would stay buried. By the time Mason returned to the missing confirmation page in the file, he understood that whoever had assembled that report had worked very hard to make a damaged aircraft look perfectly fine, and he said as much quietly to Carter, who no longer looked skeptical at all. Mason had never been a man who enjoyed standing toe-to-toe with powerful people, and nothing about the morning's tension felt comfortable to him. Years earlier, he had walked away from a stable career in military aviation maintenance after refusing to sign off on a faulty aircraft his superiors were determined to fly on schedule. His objection had been correct, but correctness had never been the point in that world, and the fallout left him isolated, his reputation quietly dismantled by people who preferred convenient silence over inconvenient truth. From that point forward, he had built a smaller life as an independent technician, taking the jobs larger companies didn't want to slow down for, living quietly, asking for little. Somewhere at home, a young son waited for him with a babysitter who would already be checking the clock, and every decision Mason made ran first through a private calculation of rent, groceries, and the small but constant expenses of raising a child alone. He never let that pressure show on his face, and he never let it shape his judgment either. The $700 on the table that morning meant something real to him after a long night of emergency work, but it had never been enough to make him exaggerate a problem that wasn't there. His only real interest was doing the job correctly, the way he always had, regardless of who stood on the other side of the room. Grace watched him from a distance and found herself doubting Logan's narrative that this was a man trying to squeeze money out of a wealthy client. Joseph pulled him aside quietly and asked whether he was certain the issue was serious enough to justify holding up the flight. Mason answered honestly that the fault might not bring the aircraft down immediately, but it was dangerous enough that no one had the right to gamble with it, and then he said the sentence that would stay with Joseph long after that morning ended. An aircraft, he said, does not forgive arrogance. Joseph said nothing in response, because he understood exactly how true that was. Logan kept pressing, telling anyone who would listen that Amelia already paid an entire in-house maintenance team and didn't need a single father pretending to be a hero for an extra fee. Mason let the insult pass in silence, refusing to dignify it with an argument he didn't need to win. He finished his documentation calmly, marking the critical warning on page 47, the page that would later determine far more than anyone in that hangar yet understood. When he signed his name to the final line of the report, he knew the signature might cost him the client standing in front of him, but he also knew it might be the only thing standing between that aircraft and a disaster no one would see coming until it was far too late to stop. Mason carried the finished report into the VIP lounge, where Amelia was running through last-minute details with Diana Cole, the company's lead counsel, and Logan, who had positioned himself close enough to control the conversation if he could. The room was lined with leather furniture and screens displaying flight paths, contract drafts, and a countdown to departure that nobody but Mason seemed to find irrelevant. He stood in the middle of that polished space looking entirely out of place. A man who clearly did not belong to the world being negotiated around him, and he did not try to soften that fact. He told them plainly that he had completed his inspection and that his recommendation was to ground the aircraft until the secondary pressure valve assembly could be properly tested with specialized equipment. Amelia's frustration flared instantly because any delay threatened the leverage she needed in Seattle, and leverage, in her experience, evaporated the moment you looked unreliable to the other side of a negotiation. Logan jumped in immediately, suggesting that Mason was hiding behind vague technical language to protect himself from blame later. Diana asked directly whether Mason had definitive proof that the aircraft would fail. Mason answered honestly that no one could promise a failure would happen, only that the data made clear the flight should not continue as planned. Amelia heard that answer as the language of someone covering himself rather than someone telling the truth, and she said so without hesitation. Mason remained calm and placed the $700 invoice on the table exactly as agreed. Amelia laughed, a short, cold sound that cut through the room. In front of her pilot, her lawyer, and her crew, she told him she would not pay $700 to be told by a man she'd hired off the tarmac that she should cancel a flight worth far more than his entire year of work. The room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical. Mason's face did not flush with anger and his voice did not rise, but something in his eyes went still and distant, the look of a man absorbing a blow he had decided not to return. Amelia kept going, telling him he should understand his place, that her fleet was worth tens of millions of dollars and could not be held hostage by the wounded feelings of a single father who clearly needed the money. Grace and Joseph both flinched at the cruelty of it, but neither of them dared interrupt a confrontation that wasn't theirs to enter. Mason folded the invoice and laid it gently on top of the file. He didn't beg and he didn't threaten. He simply pushed the report toward her and said, "You don't have to pay me." But before you fly, read page 47. Amelia assumed it was a cheap theatrical flourish meant to scare her into compliance, and Logan moved quickly to take the folder before she could even glance at it, claiming he would file it away properly. Mason looked directly at Logan and told him the page had already been duplicated into the electronic maintenance log, and that the lead pilot would be receiving his own copy within minutes. Logan's expression shifted in a way he tried hard to hide, but not quickly enough. Amelia, refusing to let a $700 invoice and a single sheet of paper derail a deal worth hundreds of millions, ordered the crew to prepare for departure exactly as scheduled. Mason turned and walked out of the lounge without another word, pausing only briefly beside Joseph to say quietly that no pressure from above was worth signing away his own conscience. By the time the lounge emptied, the file sat alone on the table, open just enough that the edge of page 47 was visible beneath the glow of the overhead lights, unread by anyone, while outside on the tarmac Amelia walked toward the aircraft already thinking about Seattle instead of the warning she had just dismissed without a second glance. Joseph settled into the cockpit and began working through the pre-departure checklist, watching most of the readouts glow a reassuring shade of green that put Logan's mind further at ease. Amelia took her seat in the cabin and immediately resumed her call with the partners waiting in Seattle, determined to prove that nothing about the morning's delay would touch the timeline of the deal. Grace sat behind her, glancing at the secondary file tucked into the seat pocket, unable to stop thinking about the page Mason had mentioned. She leaned forward and reminded Amelia gently that she still hadn't read it, only to be waved off without a second thought. Outside on the tarmac, Mason was loading his tools back into his old truck when Carter jogged over, unable to let the question go any longer, and finally asked what exactly page 47 said. Mason explained it without drama. The page documented a discrepancy between the official maintenance report and what the equipment actually showed, specifically that the secondary pressure valve had been removed and reinstalled with the wrong torque, then logged afterward as nothing more than a routine visual check rather than a full replacement with load testing. Carter asked why none of the cockpit displays had flagged the problem in red, and Mason told him that this kind of fault lived in the most dangerous space of all, the gap between not yet broken and no longer trustworthy. If the aircraft reached a high enough altitude and the primary hydraulic system shifted load onto the secondary system under the wrong conditions, the valve could respond too slowly, and that delay, even if it lasted only a few seconds, could destabilize hydraulic pressure at the exact moment stability mattered most. A few seconds meant very little in most situations, but in a private jet at altitude, under the wrong combination of stress, it could be the difference between a routine flight and a loss of control no pilot could fully recover from in time. Back in the cockpit, Joseph was reviewing the electronic version of the report that had automatically synced to his console, and his eyes settled on a single flagged line written in Mason's careful, deliberate hand. The note read simply that there remained an unresolved maintenance discrepancy involving the secondary pressure bypass valve, and that the issue required grounded verification before any flight could proceed. Joseph's hands stilled on the controls. His co-pilot asked if something was wrong, and Joseph read the description a second time, fully aware that if he chose to take off anyway, the final responsibility for whatever happened next would belong to him and no one else. Logan's voice crackled through on the radio, urging him to begin engine start without further delay. Joseph asked for more time. Logan's tone sharpened immediately, reminding him that the order had come directly from the CEO herself. Joseph's answer was simple and unshaken. The CEO, he said, was not the one who would be sitting at the controls if something went wrong at 30,000 feet. The tension over the radio thickened, Logan pushing harder, Joseph refusing to be rushed past a warning he now fully understood. Inside the cabin, Amelia noticed the unusual pause in the engine startup sequence and felt the first flicker of impatience curdle into something closer to unease. Joseph finally lifted the cabin intercom and made the announcement no one expected that morning, telling the small group on board that departure would be temporarily delayed while the crew verified a single outstanding technical detail flagged in the maintenance file. The words sounded routine to anyone listening casually, but to Joseph, Carter, and Mason, standing far apart from one another, they all understood exactly how close that single page had just come to being ignored entirely. Even with Joseph holding the flight, Logan kept pushing to move the process forward, insisting that the flagged note was nothing more than an administrative formality with no real bearing on safety. Amelia, frustrated and increasingly anxious, became convinced that Joseph had simply let himself be rattled by a contractor with a grudge, and she walked forward into the cockpit to settle the matter herself. Joseph handed her the page without a word. Amelia read it through once, but the technical phrasing still didn't fully register the danger behind it, and her irritation lingered even as her certainty began to waver. Logan moved quickly to soften the language, explaining that Mason had simply used cautious wording to protect himself from liability later, and that there was no actual evidence the aircraft posed any danger at all. Joseph insisted on bringing in a second, independent ground inspection team before anyone made a final decision. Amelia pointed out that doing so would add at least 2 more hours to a morning that had already cost her enough. Joseph asked her directly whether she would rather arrive in Seattle late or arrive in an aircraft that had never actually been verified safe. The question landed harder than Amelia expected, and for the first time that morning, her certainty cracked. At almost the same moment, as the ground crew ran a quick diagnostic test on the secondary system, a pressure signal spiked and wavered for several seconds before settling again. It was far too brief for anyone seated in the cabin to notice, but it was more than enough to drain the color from Carter's face and Joseph's. Out near the hangar, Mason heard the unmistakable change in the pitch of the secondary pump and turned without needing anyone to tell him what it meant. Carter called him back to help verify what had just happened. Logan objected loudly, insisting Mason had already been removed from the process and had no business returning. Amelia, shaken for the first time that morning, overruled him and ordered Mason brought back immediately. Mason walked toward the aircraft without any trace of satisfaction on his face. Because for him, watching the fault finally reveal itself wasn't a victory at all, only confirmation of how close everyone had come to a disaster none of them would have survived to explain. He asked for the secondary system to be fully shut down so the technical bay could be opened and the torque on every fitting properly inspected. When the valve cluster was finally exposed, Everyone gathered around it saw the same thing at once: a faint trace of fluid wear, a thin streak of leaking oil, and a gasket that had clearly been seated at the wrong angle. Carter understood immediately that this was not the kind of fault that simply happened on its own, but the unmistakable signature of maintenance work that had been rushed, or deliberately concealed. Joseph said plainly that if they had taken off, the failure would likely have surfaced exactly as the aircraft climbed through altitude, at the worst possible moment to lose control. Amelia stood frozen, unable to speak. Logan began scrambling to shift the blame onto junior staff who had supposedly handled the repair. Mason pointed at the file and said quietly that the final signature on that report did not belong to any junior staff member. Every eye in the group turned slowly toward Logan, and for the first time that morning, Amelia looked at the man she had trusted most with her fleet and understood, with a cold and sudden clarity, that he might have lied to her in ways that could have cost her everything. Diana moved quickly to have the maintenance file sealed before anyone could alter it further. Logan reached for his phone, clearly intending to call someone outside the hangar, but Grace stopped him on Amelia's direct order. Amelia demanded an explanation for why the official report never mentioned that the valve had been removed and load tested, only that it had supposedly received a routine visual check. Logan insisted his team had followed standard procedure and accused Mason of exaggerating a minor issue into a crisis. Mason refused to let the conversation drift into emotion or accusation. He asked instead for 3 specific things to be cross-checked together: the parts log, the maintenance bay security footage, and the sensor data recorded before the aircraft's most recent flight. Diana authorized access to all 3 immediately. Carter was the one who found it first, a pressure warning that had triggered the night before, later overwritten in the system and reclassified as inspection complete. The name attached to that approval belonged to Logan. Logan's composure finally broke, and he admitted, almost defensively, that he had done it to protect the deal, insisting that grounding the aircraft could have cost Amelia the entire acquisition and put hundreds of jobs at risk. Mason answered simply that no contract was worth more than a human life. Amelia looked at him then in a way she hadn't all morning, finally hearing what he was saying instead of simply waiting for him to finish talking. Logan turned on her instead, reminding her that she was the one who had always demanded no delays, no failures, and nothing that embarrassed the company in front of its partners. It was, in its own ugly way, an important truth. Amelia realized in that moment that the culture of fear inside her own company had been built, at least in part by her own hand, that she had taught the people beneath her that hiding a problem was safer than admitting one. That realization did nothing to erase what Logan had done. Diana confirmed that Logan could now face a formal investigation for falsifying safety documentation. Joseph stated plainly that he intended to report the incident exactly as it happened, with no omissions. Logan, furious, turned his anger toward Mason, insisting that a man who had been pushed out of the larger industry had no right to destroy what remained of his career. Mason's response was calm and unshaken. He told Logan that his career hadn't been destroyed by page 47, but by everything he had done to bury the truth long before that page ever existed. Security escorted Logan out of the operations area while the rest of the group stood in silence, watching the aircraft sit motionless on the tarmac, the Seattle deal now hanging by a thread no one was certain could hold. For the first time that morning, Amelia's thoughts weren't on the money at all. She walked back into the lounge, found the folded $700 invoice still sitting where she had left it, and stared at the number written across it, suddenly ashamed at how small it looked next to the disaster Mason had just managed to stop before it ever had the chance to begin. Amelia's phone rang with a call from the board, their voices already tight with frustration over a canceled flight that threatened to hand the Seattle acquisition to a competitor. One board member suggested simply chartering a different aircraft, keeping the signing date intact, and sorting out the internal mess afterward, quietly and out of view. But something in Amelia had shifted since she'd stood beside that opened valve cluster and seen the damage for herself. She told the board that if her own fleet carried a hidden safety failure, she had no business walking into a negotiation about a more reliable future for anyone else. The board accused her of letting emotion cloud her judgment. Amelia looked across the hangar at Mason, Joseph, Carter, and the ground crew still working, and made the decision to delay the acquisition entirely in order to conduct a full safety review of the fleet. It was the first time in her career that she had chosen truth over appearance without calculating the cost first. Mason was preparing to leave, believing his part in the morning's events was finished. Amelia stopped him before he reached the gate. She wanted to thank him but didn't yet know how, because the cruelty of her earlier words still hung visibly between them. She began clumsily, admitting she hadn't understood how serious that page truly was. Mason told her the problem had never been that she didn't understand it, but that she hadn't wanted to read it at all. The words struck harder than anything Logan had said all morning. Grace, standing a short distance away, watched her CEO absorb criticism without a single word of defense for what felt like the first time. Amelia asked why he hadn't shouted, hadn't forced her to listen the moment he realized she wasn't taking him seriously. Mason explained that people like her rarely listened to people raising their voices, so he had chosen instead to leave the truth written down, where no one could accuse it of being too loud or too emotional to be believed. Amelia looked down at the small invoice still folded in her hand. She offered to pay him many times the original amount. Mason refused the bonus outright. He told her he would accept exactly the $700 they had agreed on, but only if she personally signed a statement confirming that his report had prevented an unsafe aircraft from taking flight. Amelia was caught off guard by a man who had every opportunity to take advantage of the moment and chose not to. Mason told her plainly that he needed the money, but he needed his professional integrity acknowledged even more. Amelia signed the confirmation without hesitation, then asked Diana to begin drafting a formal letter restoring whatever professional standing Mason had lost years earlier after his refusal to approve an unsafe military aircraft. Mason said little in response, but something behind his eyes softened just slightly, the first real crack in the guarded composure he had carried since morning. The scene closed with Amelia transferring the $700 herself, not as a handout tossed carelessly toward someone beneath her, but as the honest repayment of a debt she finally understood in full. Diana quietly looked into Mason's professional history and found exactly what Amelia had begun to suspect. Years before, Mason had been pushed out of a military maintenance program after refusing to certify an aircraft with a similar hidden fault, a decision that was eventually handled internally but left him carrying the reputation of someone difficult, someone who couldn't simply follow orders. Amelia read through the old records and understood, with quiet discomfort, that Mason had lost years of his career for doing exactly what he had done again that morning. The parallel was impossible to ignore. If she had allowed page 47 to be dismissed, she would have become just another version of the people who had once destroyed Mason's standing for telling an inconvenient truth. She sought out Joseph and asked him directly what he truly thought of the man who had just upended her entire morning. Joseph told her that in aviation there were two kinds of people, those who wanted an aircraft to leave on time, and those who wanted an aircraft to actually deserve to leave at all, and that Mason had always belonged firmly to the second kind. The answer stayed with Amelia long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Mason returned to his modest apartment, where no children appeared in any scene, only a small pair of shoes resting by the door, and a short voicemail reminding him gently of the ordinary life waiting for him outside the chaos of the morning. He sat down, exhausted, looking at the $700 he had finally been paid. He didn't feel like a man who had won anything. He only felt the quiet relief of knowing no one had been hurt because of a decision someone else had tried to rush. Grace called on Amelia's behalf, inviting him to attend an internal hearing the following day. Mason hesitated at first, unwilling to be pulled into a corporate battle that wasn't his to fight. Grace clarified that Amelia wasn't asking him to testify against Logan out of spite, but to help correct a system that had clearly failed long before that morning. Mason sat with the request in silence for a moment. He had spent years believing that large organizations had no real use for men like him, only for the signatures they occasionally required from him. This situation, he allowed himself to consider, might actually be different. He agreed to attend, on the condition that everything discussed be documented in writing, and that no technician anywhere in the company ever again be pressured into silence simply to protect a flight schedule. Later that night, long after the hangar had emptied, Amelia sat alone in her office, rereading page 47 again and again, slowly understanding that the single sheet of paper had done far more than save a flight that morning. It had exposed with unforgiving clarity exactly how badly her own leadership had failed the people responsible for keeping her safe. The internal hearing took place in a glass-walled conference room at Langford Aerospace Holdings, filled with board members, attorneys, engineers, and a representative from the company's insurance carrier. Logan was brought in to give his account of what had happened, and he opened by positioning himself as a victim, claiming that Mason and Joseph had exaggerated a minor technical note simply to make themselves look important. Mason spoke without raising his voice and without aiming a single insult in Logan's direction. He laid out the sequence of events with plain, unembellished logic. A pressure warning had appeared the night before departure. The valve assembly had been removed. No full load test had ever been completed afterward. The report had been quietly reclassified as a routine visual inspection. The aircraft had then been placed back onto the schedule to carry the CEO to Seattle. Page 47 had documented the contradiction and forced the entire process to stop before it was too late. The insurance representative confirmed something that silenced the entire room, stating that if the aircraft had taken off after that discrepancy had already been recorded in writing, the company's coverage could very likely have been denied in the event of an accident. Logan, cornered, attempted one final counterattack, producing an old internal email in which Amelia herself had written that no minor operational issue should ever be allowed to disrupt the Seattle timeline. He argued that he had simply been following the culture she herself had created. The room went still. This was the moral turning point of the entire hearing, the moment where Logan's guilt remained undeniable, but Amelia's own responsibility as a leader could no longer be avoided either. She could have used the moment to shift every ounce of blame onto Logan and protect her own image completely. Instead, she chose to acknowledge the truth in front of everyone present. She confirmed that the email was real and admitted that it reflected a pattern of leadership built on pressure rather than accountability. At the same time, she made clear that no amount of pressure she had ever applied excused anyone from falsifying a safety record. Logan was suspended immediately, and his file was forwarded to the appropriate regulatory authority for further investigation. Amelia then announced a set of sweeping changes to company policy. Any technician, regardless of title, would now have the authority to ground a flight if they identified a credible safety risk. No manager would be permitted to alter a technical report without a clear, traceable record of the change. Every flight carrying a company executive would require an additional independent inspection on a regular basis. Anyone who reported a safety concern would be formally protected from retaliation of any kind. The board grumbled about the added cost of these new requirements, but after everything page 47 had nearly prevented, none of them found the courage to argue against it openly. Amelia turned to Mason and offered him a formal position as an independent safety advisor for the company. Mason didn't accept right away. He told her that a title meant very little if the person at the top still only read warnings after being forced to. Amelia understood immediately that this wasn't an insult but a final test she still needed to pass. She closed the meeting by telling the entire room that from that day forward, she intended to personally read every page that anyone else had hoped she would simply overlook. A few days later, Amelia drove alone to the small workshop where Mason spent most of his time, with no entourage trailing behind her, no cameras, no attorneys standing nearby for support. She arrived carrying a folder and found him exactly where she expected, working calmly on a piece of mechanical equipment as though the events of that chaotic morning had never happened at all. She handed him 3 things, one at a time. The first was a formal letter apologizing for the way she had spoken to him in front of his crew. The second was an official document acknowledging his role in preventing an unsafe flight from ever leaving the ground. The third was a new proposal allowing him to report directly to the company's safety board, bypassing both the CEO's office and flight operations entirely. Mason read through each page carefully, refusing to let himself feel anything before he understood exactly what was being offered. Amelia told him that she used to believe power simply meant making sure everyone followed her schedule without complaint. After page 47, she said, she finally understood that real power meant building a place where the lowest paid person in the room could still speak the truth without fear. Mason asked her plainly whether she was apologizing because she'd been caught, or because she genuinely understood what she had done wrong. Amelia admitted that her first instinct had been shame at being exposed, but that the feeling had shifted quickly into something deeper, the simple realization that if Mason had stayed silent like everyone else around her, she might not have survived long enough to ever feel that shame at all. This was the emotional center of everything that had happened between them. Mason did not offer forgiveness easily or quickly. He told her that trust wasn't something signed once like a contract, but something that had to be maintained continuously, the same way an aircraft required constant attention long after it left the factory floor. Amelia accepted that without argument. She proposed starting by paying every independent technician the company hired the full value of their work, without quietly pressuring them to accept less. Mason agreed to take the advisory position for a 90-day trial period. He wasn't doing it because Amelia was wealthy or powerful, but because if the system genuinely changed, more people would walk away safely because of it. Amelia allowed herself a small, honest smile, the first one that morning hadn't forced onto her face for appearances. Mason's expression eased slightly as well, the guarded distance from earlier finally beginning to soften. As Amelia left the workshop, she glanced back once and understood, fully and without doubt, that the man she had once dismissed for asking $700 was the only person in that entire hangar who had refused to put a price on her life. 3 months later, Langford Aerospace Holdings held a company-wide announcement to introduce its new safety framework, a policy employees had already begun calling informally the Page 47 rule. The principle was simple and absolute. Any single page in a safety report could ground a flight if it documented a risk that had not yet been resolved, regardless of how minor it appeared on paper. No one, no matter their title, would be permitted to dismiss a warning simply because the person who wrote it lacked an impressive job title. Mason appeared at the internal training session not as a celebrated hero brought in to bask in attention, but as a steady, practical expert sharing what experience had taught him. He told the room briefly that disasters in aviation rarely began with a sudden explosion. They almost always began with one person deciding quietly that a small detail wasn't important enough to stop for. Amelia sat among the employees that day, listening without once trying to steer the conversation or soften what he said. Joseph was promoted to lead the company's new flight safety division. Carter became an independent reporting engineer, free for the first time from the fear that a supervisor might quietly rewrite his findings. Logan remained under formal investigation and lost his position permanently, a consequence that fit cleanly with what he had chosen to hide. The Seattle acquisition, delayed at first, eventually moved forward, because the partners on the other side respected the transparency Amelia had shown far more than they would have respected a deal closed on time at the cost of honesty. Amelia hadn't won by arriving anywhere early. She had won by being willing to stop when stopping mattered most. Mason continued living the same quiet life as before, still raising his son alone, still uninterested in any kind of spotlight. But his professional reputation had finally been restored in full. In the closing scene, Amelia prepared to board another flight, and before stepping onto the aircraft, she opened the maintenance file herself and read through every page slowly and deliberately. Grace asked what exactly she was looking for. Amelia answered simply that she was looking for whatever page someone else assumed she would choose to skip. In the distance, Mason caught sight of the moment and gave a small, quiet nod of approval. The story closed on a simple truth. Sometimes the safety of an entire aircraft has nothing to do with the polished cockpit at the front and everything to do with one overlooked page and one person brave enough to refuse silence.